I had been awake since before dawn that day, lying in bed and listening to the house settle the way it always did when winter pressed against the walls. The radiator clicked on and off, and somewhere in the distance a car passed along the main road. I remember thinking that Christmas dinners were supposed to feel warm before they ever began, that there was usually some quiet anticipation, even if it came mixed with tension. That morning, all I felt was heaviness. By late afternoon, the house was already full. Coats hung over the backs of chairs. Boots lined the entryway in uneven pairs, and the smell of roasted chicken and sage drifted through the rooms. I moved between the kitchen and dining room, setting out napkins and checking the oven, doing the small familiar tasks that usually kept my hands busy and my thoughts quiet. I was 62 years old and had hosted enough family meals to know how this part went. You focused on details so you did not have to focus on people. My sister Evelyn arrived just after 4. She stepped inside as if she owned the place, brushing snow from her coat and glancing around the room, taking stock of who was already there. She was 65, always impeccably put together, her hair styled just so, her voice calm and assured. When she hugged me, it was brief and careful, the kind of embrace that carried more formality than affection. "You look tired," she said softly, as if it were an observation rather than concern. I smiled and told her it had been a long week. She nodded, already turning away, already moving toward the dining room where a few relatives were gathered. As the evening settled in, I began to notice things that felt slightly off. The seating arrangement had changed. Chairs had been shifted so that Evelyn sat at the head of the table where our father used to sit before his health declined. A couple of people who usually chatted easily with me now spoke in low voices, their eyes flicking in my direction before drifting away. When I asked if anyone wanted more coffee, no one answered right away, as if they had not heard me at all. Dinner was served without ceremony. Plates were passed, glasses filled. The clink of silverware against porcelain sounded louder than usual, filling the space where conversation should have been. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that holidays always came with awkward moments, that families were complicated by nature. Still, a tightness settled in my chest that did not ease as the minutes passed. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn cleared her throat. The sound cut cleanly through the room. She stood, picking up her wine glass, holding it lightly between her fingers. The movement drew every eye to her. Even the children stilled, sensing something different in the air. She smiled, a composed and practiced expression, and looked around the table. She spoke about family, about how important it was to protect peace and stability as we got older. Her voice was steady, almost soothing, the kind she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. Then she turned slightly, angling her body so that she did not have to look directly at me. She said she wanted to make a small toast, something symbolic, to mark an important moment. She lifted her glass higher and said that tonight was my last night as family. The words landed softly, almost gently, but they hit with a weight that stole the air from my lungs. For a moment, I thought I must have misunderstood her. I waited for laughter, for someone to say that it was a poor joke, badly timed. None came. No one spoke. No one objected. A few people shifted in their chairs. One person nodded faintly. Another looked down at their plate. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if it had been agreed upon in advance. I stayed very still. My hands rested on either side of my plate, fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. I could hear my own breathing, slow and measured, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything else seemed to fade. Evelyn continued speaking, explaining that this decision had not been easy, that it had been made with the good of the family in mind. She said words like harmony and resolution, phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface and cruel beneath them. She never said my name. She did not have to. I looked around the table, searching faces I had known my entire life. I saw discomfort, avoidance, something that might have been guilt in one or two expressions, but I did not see surprise. That was when it became clear to me that this was not an impulsive outburst. This was something that had been discussed, considered, accepted. The realization settled over me with a strange calm. I did not feel anger the way I expected. I did not feel the urge to defend myself or demand explanations. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty, the the kind that comes when a puzzle piece finally falls into place. Evelyn lowered her glass and sat back down. The room did not return to normal. Conversation did not resume. Plates remained half-finished, food growing cold as if no one remembered why we had gathered in the first place. I noticed then how deliberately the evening had been arranged. The way Evelyn had positioned herself, the way certain people avoided my gaze before she ever spoke, the careful tone she used, measured and calm, leaving no room for interruption without making the interrupter look unreasonable. My chair creaked softly as I shifted. The sound seemed to echo. Evelyn glanced at me then, just briefly, her expression unreadable, her lips pressed together in what might have been satisfaction or relief. I thought of all the holidays I had organized in that same dining room, all the times I had made sure everyone had a place, everyone felt included. I thought of the years that had passed quietly, the routines that had shaped my days, the sacrifices that no one ever seemed to notice unless they wanted to question them. My gaze drifted down to the bag resting beside my chair. It was an ordinary bag, worn leather, something I had carried for years. I had placed it there earlier without thinking much about it. Now I was acutely aware of its weight, of the way it pressed against my leg. Evelyn spoke again, this time about dessert, about how we should try to enjoy the rest of the evening. Her voice had that familiar edge, the one she used when she wanted to signal that a matter was closed. I did not respond. I did not stand. I did not reach for my bag yet. I simply sat there, letting the moment stretch, letting the silence linger a little longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. Inside, something shifted, not in a dramatic way, not like a breaking or a snapping, but like a door quietly closing. I understood then that whatever this evening was meant to be, whatever role Evelyn had planned for me to play, I was not obligated to follow her script. The table remained set, the glasses half full, the food untouched. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the street in white. Inside, I sat perfectly still, my hand resting lightly against the side of my bag, waiting for the right moment to move. The silence did not break on its own. It stretched, thin and deliberate, settling over the table like a held breath. I waited, counting the seconds by the slow rise and fall of my chest, half expecting someone to clear their throat, to laugh nervously, to say that this had gone too far. Nothing happened. Plates sat untouched. A fork slipped from someone's hand and clattered softly against the edge of a plate, the sound startling in the quiet. Evelyn folded her hands in front of her as if she had just finished a reasonable announcement, something practical and necessary. She looked calm, composed, almost relieved. I began to look at people one by one. My cousin Beth stared down at her mashed potatoes, pushing them into a neat circle without lifting her head. Uncle Raymond adjusted his napkin, then his watch, then his napkin again, his movements small and careful, across from me. Margaret sat very still, her lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the table, as if she were somewhere else entirely. No one met my gaze for more than a heartbeat. That was when I understood what Evelyn meant by we. There had been no formal discussion at this table, no raised hands or spoken votes, but the decision had already been made. The agreement lived in their silence, in the way they avoided looking at me, in the collective choice not to interrupt her. Evelyn cleared her throat again, softer this time, and spoke as if she were explaining something simple to a child. She said this was not about punishment. She said it was about keeping things calm, about avoiding further conflict. She said the family needed stability, and sometimes stability required difficult boundaries. Her words were smooth, practiced. I recognized that tone. I had heard it before in doctors' offices and bank lobbies, places where people used calm voices to make decisions that would affect someone else's life. I felt something tighten in my chest, not panic, but recognition. I thought of the past few months, of the phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered a room, of the way invitations arrived later than usual or not at all. I thought of how often Evelyn had asked questions about my plans, my finances, my intentions, all framed as concern. I had answered honestly every time, never imagining those answers were being weighed somewhere else, measured and discussed without me. My hands remained steady on the table. I noticed how strange that felt. I had always imagined that if something like this ever happened, I would react, defend myself, demand to be heard. Instead, a quiet clarity settled in. Evelyn reached for her glass again, took a small sip, then set it down. She glanced at me, her eyes sharp now, searching for something. An outburst, perhaps. Tears. Anything that would confirm the role she had assigned me. I gave her nothing. She continued, saying she hoped we could all move forward after tonight. She spoke of fresh starts, of putting old misunderstandings behind us. Each phrase landed with a dull thud, empty and rehearsed. I wondered how long she had been preparing this. How many conversations had taken place without me? How many people at this table had nodded along, grateful that someone else was doing the talking? The room felt smaller, the walls closing in just slightly. I became acutely aware of my chair, the pressure of the seat against my legs, the faint ache in my lower back from standing all afternoon. These ordinary sensations anchored me, kept me from drifting too far into my thoughts. I realized then that this moment was not only about me, it was about them, about the choices they were making in this silence, about the comfort they found in letting someone else take responsibility for a cruel decision. Margaret shifted in her seat. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water, then withdrew. She did not speak. Neither did anyone else. Evelyn smiled again, smaller this time, and said we should enjoy the rest of the evening. She mentioned dessert, the pie cooling on the counter, the coffee waiting in the kitchen. Her voice carried a gentle finality, as if she were closing a meeting. That was when I noticed how carefully everything had been arranged. The seating, the timing, the way she had waited until plates were half empty, and no one felt comfortable leaving. This was not an emotional outburst. It was a plan. A strange calm spread through me, almost like relief. The uncertainty of the past months, the quiet tension, the unanswered questions, all of it snapped into focus. I finally understood what I was standing in the middle of. I glanced down at my bag again. It sat where I had left it, close enough that my knee brushed against it when I shifted. I had brought it with me without much thought, the way I always did. But now its presence felt intentional, even though I had not planned it that way. Evelyn noticed my glance and straightened slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. For a moment, something like unease flickered across her face before she smoothed it away. No one spoke. The clock in the hallway ticked loudly, each second marking the space between us. I thought of my father then, of how he used to sit at the head of this table, his hands folded, his eyes taking in everything. I wondered what he would have said if he were here, fully himself. The thought passed through me and was gone, replaced by a steadier resolve. I did not need to argue. I did not need to convince them of anything. Their silence had already told me what I needed to know. Evelyn began to stand again, reaching for the serving dishes, ready to move the evening along. I could see the faint impatience in her movements, the desire to regain control of the room, to push past this moment before it lingered too long. I shifted in my chair, the wood creaking softly. The sound drew a few glances, quick and wary. I placed my hands in my lap, fingers brushing against the worn leather of my bag. Still I waited, the weight of the moment pressed down on the table, on the plates, on the people gathered around it. I let the silence do its work, letting it stretch just a little longer, long enough for discomfort to settle in. Inside, I felt the door close fully, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with certainty. Whatever came next would not be guided by Evelyn's script or their quiet agreement. I stayed seated, breathing evenly, aware of every eye that flicked toward me and then away again. The room held its breath, and I held mine with it, choosing my moment, letting the pause deepen before anything else could be said or done. The room stayed suspended in that moment, but my mind had already begun to drift somewhere else, back to the point where all of this had quietly started, years before anyone thought there was something to argue over. I had not planned to move back into my childhood home. It happened gradually, the way big changes often do when you tell yourself they are temporary. In the spring of 2016, my father George had what the doctors called a mild episode. That was the word they used, mild, even as he struggled to find the right words and lost track of conversations halfway through. He was 83 then, stubborn and proud, still insisting he could manage everything on his own. At first, I came by a few times a week. I brought groceries, helped with the mail, made sure his prescriptions were filled. He laughed it off, telling me I worried too much. But I could see the shifts others missed, the way he stood in the kitchen staring at the cabinets, unsure where the coffee mugs were, the way he repeated the same story twice in one afternoon, then apologized as if he had done something wrong. One afternoon, I found the stove left on. Nothing was burning yet, but the smell of gas hung faintly in the air. George sat at the table, reading the paper upside down, completely unaware. That was the moment something inside me clicked into place. This was not going to fix itself. I told Evelyn what I had seen. She listened, nodded, said she would check in more often. She had a busy life, she reminded me, work, travel, commitments. We all understood that. At least, I told myself I did. By the end of that summer, I was staying overnight more often than not. I slept on the old couch in the living room, waking at every sound. When I finally brought up the idea of moving back in, George protested, his voice tight with embarrassment. He did not want to be a burden. I told him he was not one, that it was easier for me this way. I was 60 years old then, newly easing into part-time work, my life already quieter than it had been a decade earlier. I told myself I was fortunate to be able to do this. I told myself it was the natural order of things, that he had taken care of me once, and now it was my turn. Days settled into routines. Mornings began with medication laid out in a careful row. Breakfast followed, usually oatmeal or toast, something simple. Some days George was clear and present, joking about old memories, asking about my work. Other days he drifted, calling me by my mother's name or asking when his own parents were coming by. Those were the moments that hurt the most. Not because he forgot me, but because he was so earnest when he asked. Correcting him felt like stealing something fragile. I learned his rhythms, the hours when he was most alert, the times when confusion crept in. I learned to keep my tone calm, my movements unhurried. I learned to repeat myself without sounding frustrated, even when I was tired to the bone. What I did not learn, not right away, was how invisible that work could be. Evelyn visited every few months. She would stay for an afternoon, bring a pie, comment on how well George seemed to be doing. She praised my dedication in front of him, patting my arm, calling me a saint with a laugh. I smiled and accepted it, never questioning what happened after she left. Years passed like that. The house grew quieter as my world narrowed. Friends drifted away. Invitations declined too many times. My job became something I fit around doctor appointments and physical therapy sessions. I did not resent it. I told myself this was simply the season I was in. There were small moments of grace that made it bearable. The evenings when George was lucid and told me stories about his childhood I had never heard before. The way he squeezed my hand when he was scared, even if he could not articulate why. Those moments felt private, sacred, something no one else could fully understand. I did not think of myself as making sacrifices. I thought of myself as doing what needed to be done. It was not until much later that I realized how those years looked from the outside. How easy it was for someone to reduce them to assumptions, to frame them as something else entirely. By 2018, George's condition fluctuated more noticeably. Some days he was sharp, focused, very much himself. Other days he struggled to follow the simplest conversation. The doctors said this was expected, that clarity would come and go unpredictably. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store to find George sitting at the dining table, papers neatly stacked in front of him. His posture was straight, his expression serious. He told me he had made a decision, his voice steady in a way that startled me. He said he needed to take care of things while he still could. I did not know then that he had already met with a lawyer. I did not know he had taken steps on his own, deliberately, during one of those clear windows he guarded so carefully. All I knew was the weight in his words, the finality. When he told me what he had decided, I felt a rush of emotions I could not sort through. Gratitude tangled with discomfort, pride mixed with worry. I told him it was not necessary, that I was not doing any of this for something in return. He shook his head, insisting this was his choice, not mine. That conversation changed something fundamental, even though nothing outwardly shifted right away. It drew a line that I did not fully see until much later. After that, Evelyn's calls became more frequent. Her questions grew more pointed, though still wrapped in concern. She asked about George's memory, his finances, whether he seemed confused. I answered honestly, never imagining those answers were being gathered and arranged into a story I was not part of. I continued my routines, my days blurring together in a cycle of care and quiet endurance. I did not see the whispers forming at the edges of my life. I did not hear the doubts being planted, the narratives taking shape. All I knew then was the house, the steady work of caring for someone I loved, and the belief that doing the right thing would speak for itself in the end. Sitting at that table years later, surrounded by people who had not seen those days up close, I finally understood how naive that belief had been. The silence around me in that moment did not come from nowhere. It had been building for a long time. The realization settled into me with a heaviness that felt both familiar and new. Familiar because I had carried heavy things for years, new because this one did not belong to my father. It belonged to me. I remained seated, my breathing slow, my thoughts drifting back to those early mornings and late nights, to the version of myself who had believed that love and responsibility would be enough. The room around me stayed quiet, the tension unbroken, as I sat with the full weight of that understanding and waited for what would come next. That understanding followed me back into the room like a shadow, but my thoughts stayed anchored in that earlier time, in the months when my father still had moments of sharp clarity and the future felt uncertain rather than hostile. After the conversation at the dining table with the papers laid out in front of him, George became quieter about what he had done. He did not bring it up again unless I asked, and even then he spoke carefully, choosing his words with a seriousness I had not seen in him before. He told me he wanted to be sure that the things he cared about were settled while he still could think clearly, that he did not want anyone guessing later about what he would have wanted. I remember standing at the sink that evening, rinsing dishes while he sat at the table, watching me with a look that felt both familiar and distant. He said he had met with a lawyer named Susan Hale, someone he trusted from years back when he still worked as an engineer. He said he had gone alone, that he did not want me to feel pressured or implicated. He wanted the decision to be his, clean and unquestionable. The words unsettled me, not because of what he had chosen, but because of the finality in his voice. It was the first time I had truly felt how much time mattered now, how quickly clarity could slip away. I told him again that it was not necessary, that caring for him was not something I had done with any expectation attached. He listened patiently, then shook his head in that familiar way that told me his mind was made up. He said fairness did not always mean equal, and that sometimes it meant acknowledging reality as it was, not as people wished it to be. That sentence stayed with me long after the conversation ended. In the weeks that followed, nothing outwardly changed. The house remained the same. Our routines continued, but something had shifted beneath the surface. I became more aware of how often Evelyn called, how her questions lingered on details that had never interested her before. She asked about George's memory, about whether he seemed confused lately, about whether he still handled his own bills. I answered honestly, assuming concern where perhaps there was calculation. When she asked if I thought he truly understood his finances, I said that some days were better than others, that he had good windows of clarity. I did not imagine that those words would later be rearranged into something darker. Evelyn visited that fall, arriving with the same confident energy she always carried. She hugged George warmly, praised how well he looked, commented on how clean the house was. She told me I was doing an amazing job, said it loudly enough for him to hear. He smiled, clearly pleased. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen, she lowered her voice. She asked again about the lawyer. She asked if George had talked to me about paperwork. There was an edge to her curiosity that I had not noticed before, a sharpness that made me uneasy. I told her what I knew, which was not much beyond what George had already shared. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She said we all just wanted to be sure things were handled properly, that no one wanted misunderstandings down the line. At the time, I agreed. Looking back now, I can see how that conversation marked a turning point, how easily concern slid into suspicion, how quickly care could be reframed when money entered the picture. As the years passed, George's condition became less predictable. Some mornings he woke up clear and alert, asking about the weather, making jokes, insisting on helping with small tasks. Other days he struggled to follow a conversation, growing frustrated when words slipped away from him. I learned to recognize those shifts, to adjust my expectations accordingly. Through it all, he remained aware enough to know he wanted things settled. He asked me once if I thought people would be angry about his choices. The question caught me off guard. I told him that anyone who mattered would understand, that his wishes were his own. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded, as if committing something to memory. After that, Evelyn's calls took on a different tone. She began mentioning other relatives, saying they had concerns, that they had questions. She framed herself as a messenger, someone caught in the middle. I did not realize then that she was shaping the conversation as much as relaying it. There were evenings when I sat alone in the living room after George had gone to bed, scrolling through messages I did not quite know how to answer. Questions about fairness, comments about family unity, vague reminders about how important it was to avoid conflict. Each message carried an implication without ever stating it outright. I told myself it was stress, that families always struggled when aging parents were involved. I did not want to believe there was anything more to it. Susan Hale called one afternoon to check in. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was a warmth there that put me at ease. She asked how George was doing, how I was managing. She reminded me that the documents he had signed were in order, that everything had been done properly during a period of clear capacity. I thanked her, feeling both reassured and unsettled. The call made everything feel more real, more permanent. When I mentioned it to Evelyn later, she went quiet for a moment, then said it was good to have things documented. Her smile did not quite reach her eyes. By the time the holidays approached that year, the tension had woven itself into the fabric of our interactions. Invitations came with hesitation. Conversations felt guarded. I sensed a distance growing, even as I continued my daily routines, focused on George and the house. I did not yet understand that a narrative was forming without me, that my role had already been decided in some minds. I believed that facts would eventually matter, that time and consistency would speak for themselves. Sitting at the table now, years later, I could trace the path that had led here with unsettling clarity. The careful questions, the concerned looks, the subtle shift from gratitude to scrutiny, it all fit together too neatly to ignore. The room around me remained quiet, the earlier words still hanging in the air. I felt the weight of those years settle into my bones, not as regret, but as recognition. The decision my father had made alone had set everything in motion, not because it was wrong, but because it had exposed something fragile and volatile beneath the surface. I stayed where I was, grounded by that realization. The past and the present overlapped, the long arc of care and quiet endurance meeting the sharp edge of this moment. I knew then that whatever came next would not be about explaining myself or seeking approval. It would be about letting the truth stand on its own, in its own time. The table remained set, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. I rested my hands in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my breath, and allowed the memory of those earlier conversations to fade back into place, waiting for the next shift to come. That waiting stretched into the months that followed, long before this night ever arrived, back when the tension was still quiet enough to pretend it was nothing more than worry. After that holiday season, things changed in ways that were easy to miss if you were not looking closely. Phone calls started coming at odd hours, never directly to me at first. I would hear about them later, usually in passing. Someone had called Evelyn to ask how George was doing. Someone else was concerned about whether he should still be living at home. The questions always sounded reasonable when they reached me secondhand, softened by concern. Evelyn framed herself as the messenger. She said people were just worried. She said they did not want misunderstandings. She said it was better to talk about these things openly than let resentment build. Her voice stayed gentle, almost apologetic, as if she were doing me a favor by passing along their doubts. I noticed how rarely anyone asked me directly. When I did get calls, the tone was different, careful, polite, questions wrapped in compliments. How was I holding up? Was it a lot to manage? Did I ever feel overwhelmed? Each one felt like a test I did not know I was taking. I answered honestly. I said some days were hard, some were easier. I said George had good days and bad days. I said we were managing. I never imagined that honesty could be twisted into something else. The distance grew slowly. Invitations became vague. A lunch that never got scheduled. A visit postponed indefinitely. When I reached out, conversations felt shorter, strained, like people were measuring their words. Margaret stopped dropping by the way she used to. When she did come, she stayed only a few minutes, glancing at her watch, asking after George in a tone that felt practiced. Robert followed her lead, nodding along, avoiding any real conversation. I began to sense that something was happening around me, not to me. Decisions were being discussed, opinions formed, all without my presence. I was still doing the daily work, the unglamorous work of care, but I was no longer included in the broader picture of family. One afternoon, I overheard Evelyn on the phone in the hallway. She did not know I was within earshot. Her voice was low, controlled. She spoke about responsibility, about how difficult it was when one person had so much influence. She said everyone needed to feel comfortable with the situation. When she noticed me, she ended the call quickly and smiled. She said it was nothing important, just checking in. That was the first time I felt a flicker of unease that I could not explain away. As months passed, small comments reached me through others. Someone had wondered aloud whether George truly understood what he had signed. Someone else thought it might be better if finances were reviewed, just to be safe. The words were never accusatory, but the implication hovered close. I tried to brush it off. Families go through this, I told myself. Aging parents complicate everything. People get nervous when money is involved. I did not want to believe there was anything more deliberate behind it. Still, the isolation crept in. I stopped being asked for my opinion. Updates about family matters came late or not at all. When I brought up something practical, like scheduling a visit or coordinating care, the response felt guarded, as if I were crossing a line. At the same time, Evelyn became more visible. She spoke for the family. She relayed concerns. She positioned herself as the voice of balance, the one trying to keep everyone calm. When she praised my dedication, it felt performative, something she did publicly while questioning me privately. The contradiction wore on me. Late at night, after George had gone to bed, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, scrolling through messages I had not responded to. Each one carried a weight I could not quite name. They were not hostile, but they were not kind either. They asked for reassurance without offering trust. I realized then how easily narratives form in the absence of direct conversation. How quickly someone else can fill in the gaps when you are too busy living your life to notice the story being told about you. The house began to feel different, not unsafe, but exposed, as if every choice I made was being quietly evaluated somewhere else. I caught myself second-guessing small decisions. Did I need to explain this? Should I mention that? Would this be misunderstood? It was exhausting in a way I had not anticipated. One evening, after putting George to bed, I wandered into the small room that had once been his home office. It had become a catch-all over the years. Boxes stacked against the walls, old files left untouched because I did not have the energy to sort through them. The room felt heavy with memory. I did not go in looking for answers. I went in because I needed something to occupy my hands, something concrete. I began opening boxes, sorting papers into piles, utility bills, old manuals, receipts yellowed with age. As I worked, I thought about how invisible care can be, how it happens behind closed doors, measured in hours no one else sees, how easily it can be dismissed by those who drop in occasionally and see only the surface. That night, I found nothing remarkable, just reminders of a life that had once been orderly and predictable. Still, the act of sorting grounded me. It gave shape to the unease I had been carrying. The calls continued. Evelyn checked in more often, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Was George confused today? Did he remember his appointments? Had there been any changes? I answered, choosing my words carefully now, aware of how they might be used. I could feel myself pulling back, becoming more guarded. Trust, once cracked, does not shatter loudly. It fractures in quiet lines that spread over time. By the time summer arrived, the strain was undeniable. A family gathering was discussed, then quietly restructured without my input. I found out about it through someone else, days later. When I asked Evelyn why I had not been included in the planning, she looked genuinely surprised. She said she thought I had been overwhelmed. She said she was just trying to help. Her explanation did not sit right, but I let it pass. Confrontation felt pointless without proof, and I still believed that facts would eventually speak louder than suspicion. Looking back, I can see how those months laid the groundwork for everything that followed, how the whispers became assumptions, how the assumptions hardened into conclusions. Sitting at that table now, the silence thick around me, I understood that the moment Evelyn raised her glass had not come out of nowhere. It was the result of a slow, deliberate process, one that turned care into control and concern into accusation. The realization did not make me angry. It made me alert. I stayed seated, my posture steady, my expression calm. Around me, people shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their choices pressing in. I thought again of that small room filled with boxes, of the quiet work done there, unseen and uncelebrated. Whatever came next would not be decided by whispers or sideways glances. I had lived too long in the margins of this story to remain silent now. The pause stretched on, heavy and deliberate, as the room waited for someone to move, for the evening to resume, unaware that something fundamental had already shifted beneath their feet. The pause did not break that night, but it carried me forward into the weeks that followed, into the quiet hours when the house finally slept and I was left alone with what I had begun to notice. I returned to the small office the next morning with a different intention. The room looked the same as it always had, boxes stacked neatly, dust settled along the shelves, the desk pushed against the wall beneath a window that faced the backyard. Sunlight filtered in through the blinds, catching on the edges of old folders and envelopes. It felt ordinary, almost comforting, which made what came next harder to accept. I told myself I was just organizing, clearing space, preparing for whatever came next with George. I opened drawers, sorted files, stacked papers by year, utility bills, insurance statements, old tax returns. Nothing unusual at first. The kind of paperwork that accumulates when someone has lived a long and careful life. Then I found the envelope. It was thinner than the rest, tucked between folders labeled with dates from a few years back. The paper felt newer, smoother. Inside were bank statements, several months at a time, printed on standard white paper with the logo of the regional credit union at the top. I recognized the account number immediately. It was George's primary account, the one we used for household expenses and medical bills. At first glance, everything looked normal. Balances, dates, routine transactions. I almost put them back. Then something caught my eye. There were withdrawals that did not fit. Larger amounts taken out at regular intervals. Transfers that did not correspond with any expense I could recall. I sat down at the desk and spread the pages out, aligning them carefully, comparing dates and amounts. The pattern became clear slowly, like a picture emerging from fog. The withdrawals were too consistent to be accidents, too frequent to be explained away. They began around the time George's memory had started to fluctuate more noticeably. They continued steadily for nearly 3 years. My hands did not shake. I noticed that too. I felt calm, almost detached, as I circled numbers with a pen, noting dates in the margins. This was not how I had imagined discovering something like this would feel. There was no rush of anger, no disbelief, just a steady, sinking awareness. I checked my own records. I went through the checkbook, the receipts, the notes I kept for medical expenses. None of it accounted for what I was seeing. I picked up the phone and called the credit union. The woman who answered spoke in a practiced, polite tone. She asked me to verify information, then pulled up the account history. I explained that I had questions about several transfers. I kept my voice even, careful not to accuse or assume. She read back the details, confirming the amounts and dates. Then she told me the destination account. The name was Evelyn Parker. For a moment, I simply sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the hum of the line. I asked her to repeat it, just to be sure I had heard correctly. She did, the same name, the same account. I thanked her and ended the call. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the information settle. Memories rearranged themselves in my mind. Evelyn's questions about finances, her sudden interest in George's accounts, the way she had framed concern as responsibility. It all made sense now. I did not cry. I did not shout. I gathered the statements and returned them to the desk, stacking them neatly. Then I went back to the boxes. There was more, additional statements, notes in George's handwriting, faint and uneven, scribbled in the margins, short phrases that spoke volumes. Did I pay this twice? This does not look right. Ask Evelyn. Seeing his handwriting like that felt like a blow I had not braced for. He had noticed, not clearly enough to stop it, but enough to be unsettled, enough to question himself. I organized everything carefully, dates in order, amounts highlighted, notes clipped together. Each page told the same story, one transaction at a time. By the time I finished, the sun had shifted across the room. Hours had passed without my noticing. I sat there, hands folded, looking at the folder I had assembled. It felt less like evidence and more like a record of trust quietly broken. I called Susan Hale that afternoon. Her voice was calm when she answered, familiar. I told her what I had found, sticking to facts, listing dates and amounts. I could hear the change in her tone as I spoke, the professional focus sharpening. She asked me to bring everything in. When I arrived at her office the next day, she reviewed the documents carefully, page by page. She did not rush. She did not speculate. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious. She said this was not a misunderstanding. She said the pattern suggested intent. She said what mattered most was that George had been vulnerable during that period. I asked her what I should do next. She told me to document everything, to keep the originals safe. She said there would be steps, but they did not have to be taken immediately. She said sometimes the timing mattered as much as the facts. I drove home in silence, the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. The world outside looked unchanged. People went about their day, cars passed, stores opened and closed. It struck me how something so significant could exist alongside such ordinary motion. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder again. I reviewed each page, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand fully what I was holding. This was not anger. It was clarity. I thought about the family conversations, the whispers, the judgment, the way Evelyn had positioned herself as the protector of fairness. I understood now what she had been protecting. The hostility, the pressure, the orchestrated silence at that dinner. None of it had been about concern for George or harmony for the family. It had been about fear. I closed the folder and slid it into my bag. The decision was quiet and simple. I did not plan a confrontation. I did not rehearse what I would say. I only knew that I would not walk into another family gathering unprepared again. The house settled into its familiar nighttime sounds. George slept upstairs, unaware of the shift that had occurred beneath his roof. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, listening to his breathing, steady and soft. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed, the weight of the folder beside me, waiting for the moment when it would no longer belong only to me. I slept lightly that night, not because of fear, but because my mind would not let go of what it now understood. By morning, the decision I had made felt settled, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The days leading up to the dinner moved slowly. I went through my routines as I always did, helping George dress, preparing his meals, keeping track of appointments. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Evelyn called twice that week. Her voice was pleasant, almost warm. She said she was looking forward to seeing everyone together. She asked if I needed help with anything, offered to bring dessert. I thanked her and said we had it covered. I could hear the slight hesitation before she hung up, the pause of someone listening for something that never came. I did not mention the folder. I did not hint at what I knew. I let her believe the story was still unfolding the way she expected. On the day of the dinner, I placed the folder in my bag before I even put my coat on. I did not check it again. I knew what was inside. I had reviewed it enough times to see the pattern in my sleep. The bag felt heavier than usual as I lifted it onto my shoulder, but the weight was grounding rather than burdensome. When I arrived at the house, everything looked familiar. Decorations hung where they always had. The table was set with the same dishes we had used for years. If I had not known better, I might have believed this was just another gathering, another uncomfortable but manageable evening. Evelyn greeted me at the door with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She took my coat, commented on the weather, asked how George was doing. I answered politely, evenly, keeping my tone light. There was a brief moment when our eyes met, something unspoken passing between us. Then she turned away to tend to the others. I took my seat and placed my bag beside my chair, close enough that my calf brushed against it. The familiarity of the gesture calmed me. I did not need to rush. I did not need to interrupt. Time was on my side. When Evelyn stood and raised her glass, I let her finish. I did not shift in my seat. I did not clear my throat or offer a response. I watched her deliver her speech with the same composed certainty she used when she believed she was in control. The silence that followed was exactly as she had planned. Heavy, pressured, designed to move the evening forward without resistance. I waited until she sat back down. Only then did I move. The sound of the zipper opening was quiet, barely audible over the hum of the room. I reached into my bag and took out the folder, the edges straight, the papers inside neatly aligned. I did not look at anyone as I placed it on the table. I slid it forward slowly until it rested directly in front of Evelyn. The movement drew attention without force. Conversation stopped. Eyes followed the folder as if it had appeared on its own. I spoke only once. I said she would not be needing that anymore. My voice was steady, conversational, the way you might speak when returning something that no longer belonged to its owner. I did not raise it. I did not add anything else. Evelyn stared at the folder for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed lightly, the sound sharp and quick. She said she had no idea what I was talking about. She reached for the folder with deliberate casualness, as if to prove that nothing about this concerned her. When she opened it, her confidence held for the space of a breath. Her eyes moved across the first page, then back again, as if she were rereading a line she did not like. She frowned slightly, her mouth tightening. She turned the page. I watched her carefully, not with satisfaction, but with attention. The shift was subtle at first, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way she inhaled more sharply than before. Someone across the table leaned forward. A chair scraped faintly against the floor. Evelyn said my name then, softly, almost indulgently, as if to suggest there had been a mistake. She flipped another page, faster this time. Her fingers trembled, just enough to notice. She glanced up, her eyes searching the room, looking for an ally, a cue, something to anchor herself to. No one met her gaze. I remained still. I did not explain. I did not point out dates or amounts. The documents spoke for themselves. Evelyn's breathing changed. The color drained from her face in a way makeup could not hide. She closed the folder, then opened it again, as if hoping the contents might have rearranged themselves. She asked where I got this. The question came out strained, the calm gone from her voice. I told her it had been in the house all along. That was all. The room felt suspended, balanced on the edge of something inevitable. I could sense the confusion spreading, the pieces clicking into place for people who had only heard fragments before. Evelyn's hand tightened around the folder. She tried to speak again, but the words did not come out smoothly this time. She looked at me with something close to panic, then back down at the papers. For the first time that evening, she looked small. I did not take the folder back. I did not reach for it or close it or gesture toward it. I let it sit between us, an unmovable object on a table that had once been used for comfort and celebration. The silence that followed was different from the one she had orchestrated earlier. This one was not agreement. It was reckoning. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of anger. What I felt was relief, not because the truth was out, but because I no longer had to carry it alone. Evelyn's lips parted as if she were about to say something, to offer an explanation or an excuse. Before she could, a sound broke the stillness, the clink of glass against wood as her wine glass tipped and rolled, spilling its contents across the table. No one moved to help her. I stayed where I was, my hands folded in my lap, my posture relaxed. The moment had arrived on its own, without force or drama. All I had done was wait for it. The room held its breath again, but this time, the pause did not belong to her. The room did not erupt the way people imagine moments like that do. There was no shouting, no gasps loud enough to fill the space. Instead, everything slowed, as if time itself had decided to watch what would happen next. Evelyn stared at the spill on the table, red wine spreading across the white cloth in an uneven stain. For a second, she seemed focused on that alone, as if it were a problem she could still fix. She reached for a napkin, her hand missing it by an inch. When she finally grabbed it, her fingers fumbled, smearing the liquid rather than blotting it. Someone pushed back their chair. The sound was sharp in the quiet. Evelyn straightened. The napkin crumpled in her hand. She tried to smile again, but the expression collapsed halfway, leaving something strained and brittle in its place. She looked around the table, opening her mouth as if to explain, to laugh it off, to turn it into something smaller than it was. What came out instead was a question about why those papers were even relevant, why anyone should be looking at old statements now. Her voice wavered, rising slightly at the end, as though she were asking for reassurance rather than making a point. No one answered her right away. Margaret shifted in her chair. I saw her hands tremble as she folded them together, knuckles whitening. She looked at Evelyn, then at the folder, then finally at me. Her eyes were wet, her face tight with something that looked like regret. She said quietly that she had wondered about the money for a long time. Not accused, not suspected outright, but wondered. She said she had noticed how often Evelyn talked about fairness, about protecting the family, about making sure nothing improper happened. She said she had asked herself why someone so concerned seemed so anxious. Her words landed softly, but they changed the air in the room. Evelyn turned toward her, disbelief flashing across her face. She asked how Margaret could say that, how she could sit there and question her after everything she had done for the family. The volume of her voice crept upward, the control slipping with each sentence. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. She only said that seeing the dates and the amounts made it impossible to look away anymore. Robert leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. He picked up one of the pages from the folder, glancing at it briefly before setting it down again. He did not say much, only that the pattern was clear, that it was not something that happened by accident. Evelyn shook her head, insisting there had to be an explanation, that George had wanted to help her, that she would never take advantage of him. The words tumbled over each other now, losing their earlier polish. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how she never denied the transfers themselves, only the intention behind them. Someone at the far end of the table asked what George would have wanted. The question hung there, heavy and uncomfortable. Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that evening, she did not have an answer ready. The room filled with small movements, people shifting in their seats, hands clasping and unclasping, a glass being set down too hard. No one looked comfortable anymore. The certainty Evelyn had relied on was gone, replaced by confusion and unease. I felt a strange detachment settle over me. Not numbness, but distance. I was aware of my own breathing, steady and calm. Even as the conversation twisted and turned around me, I had spent years anticipating other people's needs, managing emotions that were not my own. In that moment, I realized I did not need to do that anymore. Evelyn looked at me again, her eyes sharp with something close to desperation. She said my name and asked if I was really going to do this, whatever that meant. She said we were family, that airing things like this would destroy what little harmony we had left. I told her, evenly, that the papers had not destroyed anything. They had only shown what was already there. My voice surprised even me. It was calm, almost gentle. I did not accuse, I did not argue. I stated a fact and let it stand. Evelyn's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of her posture. She sank back into her chair, the napkin slipping from her hand onto the floor. For a moment, she looked older than her 65 years, smaller than the woman who had stood so confidently only minutes before. No one rushed to comfort her. The silence that followed was different from the one earlier in the evening. That silence had been tight and controlled, designed to enforce agreement. This one was loose, unsettled, filled with the weight of realization. I glanced around the table again. Some faces held shock. Others held something like relief. A few looked ashamed. I recognized that expression. I had worn it myself, years ago, when I chose not to confront things I did not want to see. Margaret wiped her eyes and apologized to me, her voice breaking. She said she should have spoken up sooner, that she should not have let things get this far. I told her quietly that she did not owe me anything. That acknowledgement was enough. Evelyn laughed then, a short, hollow sound. She said this was all being blown out of proportion, that people were overreacting, but the words fell flat, landing nowhere. No one responded. The momentum had shifted beyond her reach. A chair scraped back as someone stood, murmuring that they needed some air. Another followed. The room began to thin, not in a dramatic exodus, but in a gradual retreat. People stepped away from the table as if it had become something dangerous. I stayed seated, I watched as Evelyn gathered herself, smoothing her hair, straightening her jacket, trying to reconstruct the image she had carefully built. Each small adjustment felt futile now, like arranging furniture in a house with a cracked foundation. She picked up the folder again, this time holding it tightly against her chest. Her gaze flicked toward the doorway, then back to the table, as if calculating her next move. She did not look at me. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to fill the space, to smooth things over, to offer comfort or compromise. The truth was no longer mine alone to manage. The room settled into an uneasy quiet as more people drifted away. Conversations breaking into hushed fragments in the next room. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen sounded distant, almost irrelevant. I sat there, my hands resting lightly on my lap, feeling the weight of the moment without being crushed by it. This was not victory. It was not revenge in the way people like to imagine it. It was simply the point where denial could no longer hold. Evelyn finally stood, the chair legs scraping loudly as she pushed it back. She did not say goodbye. She did not meet anyone's eyes. She walked out of the dining room, the folder tucked under her arm like something fragile. When the door closed behind her, the sound echoed through the house. I remained where I was, the table half cleared, the wine stain spreading slowly into the cloth. The evening had fractured, not with noise, but with truth. No one spoke to fill the silence that followed. And for the first time all night, I did not feel alone in it. The pause lingered, heavy but different now, as the reality of what had been revealed settled into the room and into each person who remained. What followed did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in quiet pieces, the way consequences often do when no one is shouting anymore. The house emptied little by little that night. People gathered coats, murmured excuses, avoided eye contact. No one said much to me as they left, but the looks they gave were different now, less certain, less assured. The door closed behind the last of them, and the silence that remained felt deeper than before, but it no longer pressed against my chest. I stood alone in the dining room for a long moment, staring at the table. The wine stain had spread outward, darker at the edges, soaking into the cloth. It seemed like a small thing to focus on, but it grounded me. I reached for a towel and blotted it carefully, methodically, as if restoring order could begin with something simple. George slept through all of it. When I went upstairs later, I paused outside his bedroom door, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. He lay on his side, one hand curled near his face, peaceful in a way that felt almost sacred. I did not wake him. There was nothing he needed to know yet, and perhaps nothing he ever would. The days that followed were quiet in a different way. Phones stayed silent longer than usual. Messages arrived without the familiar tone of concern or accusation. When they did come, they were careful, tentative. People asked how I was doing. They asked how George was doing. No one asked me to explain. Evelyn did not call. I heard about her through others. Margaret stopped by one afternoon, her visit unannounced but welcome. She brought soup and sat with me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her mug. She told me Evelyn had left early that night and gone straight home. She said Daniel had not been kind when she arrived, that questions had been asked and answers had not come easily. Margaret spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. She said there were financial advisors involved now. She said the bank had flagged the account and placed a temporary hold while things were reviewed. She did not say more than that, and I did not ask. A week later, Susan Hale called. She said the credit union had reached out to her office. She said the documentation I provided had prompted a formal review. Her voice was steady, professional. She told me there was nothing I needed to do at that moment, that these processes took time. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange sense of distance from it all. This was happening, but it was no longer something I had to carry alone. Life did not stop. George still needed help with his routines. Meals still had to be prepared. Appointments kept coming. The difference was subtle but profound. I moved through my days without the constant background hum of suspicion, without the sense that every action was being measured somewhere else. Daniel came by one afternoon when I was in the garden. He stood at the edge of the yard, hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He looked older than his 67 years. He said he was sorry. The words were quiet, almost lost in the breeze. He said he had not known everything. that he had trusted Evelyn to handle certain things. He said trust was a strange thing, how easily it shifted once cracks appeared. I listened. I did not reassure him. I did not offer absolution. His apology was not something I needed to accept or reject. It was simply information. Not long after that, I learned they were separating. There were no dramatic announcements, no public statements, just a gradual unraveling. Daniel moved out. Evelyn stopped attending family gatherings altogether. Her name became something people hesitated to say aloud. The family itself did not fracture in a single dramatic moment. It receded. Gatherings grew smaller, conversations grew more careful. Some people reached out to me directly for the first time in months, speaking with a humility that felt unfamiliar. Margaret apologized again one evening as we sat together in the living room. She said she had been afraid to rock the boat. She said it had been easier to believe there was a misunderstanding than to confront the possibility of wrongdoing. I told her I understood, and I did. Understanding did not mean forgetting, but it did mean releasing myself from the need for resentment. Carrying that would have been another kind of burden. As weeks passed, the house began to feel different, lighter, somehow. The rooms no longer held the same tension they once had. I reorganized the dining room, replacing the stained tablecloth with a new one. I moved a few pieces of furniture, small changes that marked a shift. I found myself sitting more often by the window in the evenings, watching the light fade from the yard. There was a calm in those moments that I had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but steadiness. I thought often about the word revenge and how poorly it fit what had happened. There had been no plotting, no triumph. The truth had simply been allowed to stand where it could no longer be ignored. The family did not come rushing back with apologies or explanations, and that was fine. What returned instead was something quieter, respect, perhaps, or caution, or the understanding that I was no longer someone to be spoken about rather than spoken to. George had a particularly clear day one afternoon. We sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the sun warming our faces. He looked at me and asked if everything was all right. The question was simple, unburdened by context. I told him yes, and for the first time in a long while, it felt true. The season turned slowly, leaves fell, winter crept in. Life settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by fewer expectations and firmer boundaries. I did not feel victorious. I felt grounded. There was peace in knowing that the story being told about me was no longer someone else's invention. It belonged to me again. As I cleared the dinner dishes one evening, alone in the quiet house, I paused and looked around. The echoes of that night felt distant now, softened by time and clarity. What had shattered was not the family, but an illusion. And what remained, though smaller, felt more honest. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the stillness, aware that the next chapter of my life was beginning, not with fanfare, but with resolve. I did not wake up the next morning feeling triumphant. There was no rush of relief, no sense that something had been won. What I felt instead was space. Space where tension used to live. Space to think without replaying conversations in my head or bracing for the next phone call that might question my motives. Life settled into a quieter rhythm after that. George still needed me, and that part of my world did not change. I helped him dress, prepared his meals, reminded him gently when words slipped away. The difference was in how I carried myself while doing it. I was no longer waiting for approval or fearing judgment. I was simply present. The house seemed to breathe differently. Mornings were calmer. Evenings were softer. I noticed small things again. The way sunlight moved across the kitchen floor, the sound of birds in the yard, the comfort of routine without the weight of suspicion pressing down on it. Family gatherings became rare. When they did happen, they were smaller, quieter. Some people reached out cautiously, unsure of their footing. Others stayed away entirely. I did not chase anyone. I had learned that not every absence needed to be filled. Margaret visited often. Our conversations were slower now, more honest. She spoke about her regrets, about how fear can make people complicit in ways they do not recognize until it is too late. I listened without judgment. We were both older now, both carrying our own lessons. Evelyn remained distant. I heard bits and pieces through others, never directly from her. The financial review continued. Lawyers exchanged letters. Her world had narrowed in ways she had never anticipated. I did not take pleasure in that. I did not feel responsible for it either. Consequences had a way of unfolding on their own once truth was no longer hidden. Daniel moved on with his life quietly. He sent a card once, a short note wishing me well. I placed it in a drawer and went on with my day. What surprised me most was how little I thought about revenge. I had spent years imagining what justice might look like if I were ever truly wronged. In the end, it was not dramatic or loud. It did not involve confrontation or shouting. It was simply the removal of lies. George had more moments of clarity that winter. We spent afternoons sitting together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing silence. One day he looked at me with a seriousness that felt familiar and asked if I was tired. I told him sometimes. He nodded and said he was glad I was there. That was enough. As the months passed, I began to understand something I had never been taught growing up. Family is not defined by blood alone, or by tradition, or by who shows up to the table on holidays. It is defined by who respects your truth and who is willing to sit with it. Even when it is uncomfortable, letting go of the idea of a perfect family was painful, but holding on to it had been more damaging. Once I released that expectation, what remained felt lighter, more honest. I set boundaries I had never set before. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. These changes were quiet, internal, but they reshaped my life in ways I could feel every day. There were moments of sadness. Of course there were. Grief does not disappear just because clarity arrives. I grieved the sister I thought I had. I grieved the family I believed in. But grief no longer controlled me. It sat beside me, acknowledged, no longer denied. One evening, as I cleared the table after a simple dinner, I paused and looked around the room. The same room where everything had come apart now felt steady again. Not because nothing had happened, but because I had survived it with my integrity intact. That mattered more than I ever expected. I know there are people listening who recognize parts of themselves in this story, people who have given quietly for years, only to find their intentions questioned or their sacrifices dismissed. People who have been judged by those who never carried the weight they carried. If that is you, I want you to know something I learned late in life. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not have to prove your worth to people who benefit from doubting it, and you do not need revenge to reclaim yourself. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let the truth stand where it belongs, and then step back. As I move forward now, my life is smaller in some ways, but it is truer. The people who remain are those who see me clearly. The rest have faded into memory, where they belong. If this story resonated with you, if you have lived through something similar or are still carrying it quietly, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. Stories like ours are often lived in silence, but they do not have to stay there. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about finding clarity after betrayal and peace after long endurance, I hope you will stay with me.